Marcus Johnson woke up at 5:30 a.m., just like he did every morning. The small apartment he called home was quiet, except for the soft purring of his old tabby cat, Luna. Through his bedroom window, he could see the first hints of dawn breaking over the Boston skyline. At 32 years old, Marcus had settled into a life that was simple but meaningful. As he prepared for another day of teaching physics at Brighton High School, Marcus caught his reflection in the bathroom mirror. His dark skin had a healthy glow, and despite the early hour, his brown eyes were alert and focused. He straightened his navy blue tie, a gift from his mother on his first day of teaching 5 years ago, and grabbed his worn leather briefcase. The morning air was crisp as Marcus walked the 3 blocks to the local cafe where Miss Jenny, the elderly owner, always had his coffee ready. "Good morning, sugar," she called out as he entered. The bell above the door chimed softly, and the smell of fresh coffee filled his nose. "The usual for my favorite teacher." "Yes, please, Miss Jenny," Marcus replied with a warm smile. He noticed her limping slightly and asked, "How's that hip doing?" "Oh, you know how it is with us old folks," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "But I've got my daughter coming this weekend to help around the cafe." Marcus insisted on paying full price for his coffee, even though Miss Jenny always tried to give him a discount. He believed in supporting local businesses, especially those run by people who had become like family to him over the years. At school, Marcus's day was busier than usual. His first period physics class was tackling gravity and acceleration, concepts that usually confuse students. But Marcus had a special way of making complex ideas simple. He used everyday examples and told stories that made the science come alive. "Think about dropping your phone," he explained to his students, demonstrating with an eraser. "The moment it leaves your hand, gravity begins its work. It's the same force that keeps the moon orbiting Earth and holds our entire solar system together." The students watched, fascinated, as he connected their daily lives to the wonders of physics. During lunch break, Marcus sat in his classroom grading papers instead of joining the other teachers in the staff room. His colleague, Sarah Chen, stopped by with a sandwich she bought for him, knowing he often forgot to eat when he was busy. "You need to take better care of yourself, Marcus," Sarah said, placing the sandwich on his desk. "All these extra hours you put in." Marcus looked up from his papers and smiled. "Thanks, Sarah. I just want to make sure these kids really understand the material. Rodriguez's family is counting on their son getting that science scholarship, and Thompson's daughter wants to be an engineer." Sarah shook her head, but her eyes were kind. "Always thinking about everyone else. That's why you're the student's favorite teacher." After school, Marcus stayed late to help Jessica Thompson with her physics project. Her family couldn't afford a tutor, but Marcus saw real potential in her. As they worked through the problems, Jessica's eyes lit up with understanding. "Mr. Johnson," she said excitedly, "I think I finally get it." "See? I told you could do it," Marcus replied, feeling proud of her progress. It was almost 5 p.m. when Marcus finally left the school. He needed to stop at Wilson's grocery store, not just for his own shopping, but also to pick up supplies for old Mr. Parker down the street, who had trouble walking after his hip surgery. The weather had turned chilly, and dark clouds threatened rain. Marcus pulled his worn jacket tighter around his shoulders. He should probably buy a new one, but between helping his mother with her medical bills and contributing to his sister's college fund, there wasn't much left from his teacher's salary. As he walked toward the grocery store, Marcus had no idea that this ordinary day was about to become extraordinary. He was simply doing what he always did, living his life with kindness and purpose, not for recognition or reward, but because that's who he was. Little did he know that fate had other plans for him, and his simple act of daily kindness was about to change his life forever. The evening air grew colder as Marcus left Wilson's grocery store. His arms were full with 2 heavy brown paper bags, one for himself and one for Mr. Parker. Inside, he had carefully selected fresh vegetables, soup cans, and a special treat of chocolate cookies that Mr. Parker's grandchildren loved when they visited. Snow had started to fall, and the sidewalks were becoming slippery. Marcus walked carefully, remembering how his mother always warned him about Boston's treacherous winter weather. "Better slow than sorry," she would say, and those words echoed in his mind as he watched other pedestrians rush in home. As he approached Beacon Street, one of the wealthiest areas in Boston, Marcus noticed how different this neighborhood was from his own. Fancy cars lined the streets and elegant buildings reached toward the darkening sky. The street lights were coming on, casting a warm glow on the fresh snow. That's when he saw her. An elderly white woman, probably in her late 70s, was struggling at the top of the steps of one of the most expensive apartment buildings in the area. She wore a beautiful blue wool coat and pearl earrings that caught the light. But what caught Marcus's attention was how she swayed unsteadily on her feet. The doorman had stepped inside for a moment, and no one else was around. The woman took one shaky step, then another. Marcus watched as she reached for the railing but missed. Time seemed to slow down. Without thinking, Marcus dropped both grocery bags. Oranges rolled across the sidewalk, and a jar of sauce shattered, but he didn't care. He sprinted forward, his teacher's shoes slipping slightly on the icy pavement. His heart pounded as he saw the woman begin to fall. "Hold on," he called out, lunging forward. Just before she would have hit the concrete steps, Marcus caught her. One arm went around her shoulders, the other supporting her back. The force of stopping her fall made him grunt, but he held firm, keeping them both upright. "Oh!" the woman gasped, her blue eyes wide with surprise and relief. Her hands clutched Marcus's coat sleeves. "Oh my goodness!" "I got you, ma'am," Marcus said softly, helping her regain her balance. "Are you all right?" The woman took a few deep breaths, still holding onto Marcus's arm. "Thanks to you, young man. Thanks to you." Her voice was shaky but warm. "I'm Eleanor Whitman. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here." The doorman rushed back out, looking horrified. "Mrs. Whitman, I'm so sorry. I just stepped away for a second to help Mr. Thompson with his packages." "It's quite all right, Charles," Mrs. Whitman said, still holding Marcus's arm. "This kind gentleman saved me from what could have been a very nasty fall." Marcus noticed she was still trembling slightly. "Ma'am, would you like to sit down for a moment? Sometimes a shock like this can make you feel unsteady." Mrs. Whitman nodded gratefully, and Marcus carefully helped her to the lobby's elegant bench. The doorman hurried to get her a glass of water. "You're very thoughtful," Mrs. Whitman said, studying Marcus's face. "Most people these days just rush past. What's your name?" "Marcus Johnson, ma'am. I teach physics at Brighton High." "A teacher? How wonderful." Her eyes sparkled with interest. "My late husband was passionate about education. He always said teachers were society's true heroes." As they talked, Marcus noticed his groceries scattered across the sidewalk. Mrs. Whitman followed his gaze and looked distressed. "Oh dear, you dropped everything to help me. Charles, please help Mr. Johnson collect his things." She turned back to Marcus. "You must let me replace what was broken." Marcus shook his head politely. "Please don't worry about it, Mrs. Whitman. I'm just glad you're safe." "At least let me have my driver take you home," she insisted. "It's getting dark, and the weather's only getting worse." Before Marcus could refuse, Mrs. Whitman had already signaled to a man standing discreetly in the corner of the lobby. "James, please bring the car around. We're going to take this kind gentleman home." As they waited, neither Marcus nor Mrs. Whitman realized that this chance encounter would change both their lives forever. Sometimes, the biggest moments come disguised as simple acts of kindness, wrapped in ordinary evenings and scattered groceries. Mrs. Whitman's car was a sleek black Mercedes, its interior warm and smelling of leather. Marcus sat somewhat uncomfortably, holding his salvaged groceries on his lap while James, the driver, smoothly guided the vehicle through Boston's snowy streets. "Brighton High School," Mrs. Whitman said thoughtfully, breaking the silence. "My husband Robert used to give guest lectures there years ago." She turned to Marcus with genuine interest. "How long have you been teaching?" "5 years now, ma'am," Marcus replied. He noticed how her eyes lit up at the mention of teaching, and something about her warmth made him continue. "I actually started a small after-school science program for students who can't afford tutoring." "Tell me more about that," Mrs. Whitman encouraged, shifting in her seat to face him better. Marcus found himself sharing stories about his students, about Maria Rodriguez, who worked at her family's restaurant every evening but still came to early morning study sessions, determined to become a doctor. About Tommy Chen, who struggled with English but showed brilliant understanding of physics through his experiments. "The kids just need someone to believe in them," Marcus explained, forgetting for a moment that he was sitting in a luxury car with a wealthy stranger. Many of them would be the first in their families to go to college. Mrs. Whitman listened intently, occasionally asking thoughtful questions. When Marcus mentioned buying extra supplies with his own money, she frowned slightly but said nothing. "What made you choose teaching?" she asked instead. Marcus smiled, remembering. "My 10th grade physics teacher, Mr. Collins. He showed me that science wasn't just formulas in a book. It was the story of how our universe works. He stayed after school to help me prepare for competitions because my mother couldn't afford a tutor." "And now you're doing the same for your students," Mrs. Whitman observed softly. The car turned onto Marcus's street, where the street lights were dimmer and the buildings more modest. Some might have felt embarrassed about the contrast with Mrs. Whitman's neighborhood, but Marcus felt only pride in his community. He pointed out Miss Jenny's cafe, now closed for the day, its windows glowing warmly. "That's where I get my coffee every morning," he explained. "Miss Jenny's been running it for 30 years. And there's Mr. Parker's house. He's the reason I was getting extra groceries today. He had hip surgery last month." Mrs. Whitman's eyes followed his gestures, taking in the small businesses and apartment buildings. "You know everyone here, don't you?" "Most people," Marcus admitted. "It's a good neighborhood. Everyone looks out for each other." The car stopped in front of Marcus's building. Before he could reach for the door handle, James was already outside, opening it for him. "Mr. Johnson," Mrs. Whitman said, reaching into her purse. "Please let me." Marcus shook his head politely but firmly. "No payment needed, Mrs. Whitman. I'm just glad I was there to help." Instead of insisting, Mrs. Whitman studied him for a long moment. Then she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small business card. "My husband used to say that character reveals itself in the moments when no one is watching, and in the kindness we show without expectation of reward." She handed him the card. It was simple but elegant, with just her name and a phone number. "If you ever need anything, anything at all, please call me, and thank you, not just for saving me from a fall, but for reminding me that there are still people who do good simply because it's right." Marcus accepted the card, touched by her words. As he stepped out into the snow, carrying his slightly damaged groceries, Mrs. Whitman called out one last time. "Mr. Johnson, would you mind if I came to observe one of your classes sometime? Robert always said you could tell everything about a teacher by watching them with their students." "Of course, Mrs. Whitman. You're welcome anytime." As the Mercedes pulled away, Marcus stood for a moment in the falling snow. Something about Mrs. Whitman reminded him of his own grandmother, the same wisdom in her eyes, the same way of really listening when people spoke. What he didn't know was that Eleanor Whitman wasn't just any wealthy widow, and that her request to visit his class wasn't just casual interest. As her car disappeared into the snowy night, wheels were already turning in her mind, plans forming that would change not just Marcus's life, but the lives of countless others. Marcus climbed the 3 flights of stairs to his apartment, his mind still on the unusual events of the evening. Luna, his cat, greeted him at the door with an impatient meow, reminding him that he was late for her dinner. "Sorry, girl," he said, setting down the damaged grocery bags on his small kitchen counter. "Had quite an adventure today." As he sorted through the salvaged groceries, his phone buzzed. It was a text from his mother. "Baby, don't forget to eat something real for dinner. Not just those microwave meals." Marcus smiled, typing back, "Yes, Mama. Making pasta tonight." His mother had raised him and his sister alone after their father passed away, working 2 jobs but never missing a school event. She was the reason he understood the importance of showing up for people. The pasta was just starting to boil when his phone rang again. This time it was Mr. Parker, wondering about his groceries. Marcus felt a pang of guilt about the broken jar of sauce. "I'm sorry, Mr. Parker. There was a bit of an accident with some of the groceries, but I'll bring what I salvaged in about an hour. I'll pick up the rest tomorrow after school." "No rush, son." Mr. Parker's voice was warm. "Sarah told me she saw you helping that Thompson girl with physics again after school. You're doing good work with those kids." After eating a quick dinner, Marcus carried the undamaged groceries down to Mr. Parker's apartment on the 1st floor. The old man insisted he stay for a cup of tea, as he always did. "Tell me about your day," Mr. Parker said, pouring tea into his deceased wife's favorite china cups. "Something different about you tonight. Got that look my Ellen used to get when something interesting happened." So Marcus told him about Mrs. Whitman and the near fall, about the Mercedes ride and their conversation. Mr. Parker listened carefully, nodding occasionally. Eleanor Whitman, you say? Mr. Parker's eyes widened slightly. Used to read about her and her husband in the papers. Big education supporters, if I remember right. Their foundation helped build that new library downtown. Marcus sat up straighter, surprised. He hadn't realized who Mrs. Whitman was. She had seemed so normal, despite her obvious wealth. Back in his apartment, Marcus settled at his small desk to grade papers. He had promised his students he'd have their physics tests marked by tomorrow. The desk lamp cast a warm glow as he worked, occasionally stopping to write encouraging notes on papers where students had shown improvement. Around 10 p.m., his sister Tanya called from college. "Big brother, guess who got an A on their chemistry midterm?" Marcus grinned. "That's my girl. All those study sessions paid off, huh?" "Couldn't have done it without you," Tanya said. "How was your day? Mama said you were late getting home." As Marcus told her about Mrs. Whitman, Tanya interrupted with excitement. "Wait, the Eleanor Whitman? Marcus, her foundation gives out the biggest education grants in New England. We learned about them in my education policy class." "Tanya, she's just a nice lady who needed help," Marcus said firmly. "I didn't do it for any reason except it was the right thing to do." "That's why you're the best brother ever," Tanya said softly. "But sometimes good things happen to good people, you know?" After hanging up, Marcus tried to return to his grading, but found his mind wandering. He took out Mrs. Whitman's business card, looking at the elegant writing. Then he shook his head and tucked it away in his wallet. He wasn't looking for rewards or recognition. What Marcus didn't know was that at that very moment, in her penthouse apartment, Eleanor Whitman was making a series of important phone calls. As she looked out over the snowy Boston skyline, she spoke to lawyers, financial advisors, and the head of her family's foundation. "Yes, I'm quite sure," she was saying. "I found exactly the right person. Tomorrow, everything changes." But Marcus, unaware of these developments, finally finished his grading around midnight. He set his alarm for 5:30 a.m., checked that Luna had enough water, and got ready for bed. Tomorrow was another school day, and his students were counting on him. Some of the biggest moments in life come quietly, sneaking in between ordinary tasks and everyday kindness. As Marcus drifted off to sleep, he had no idea that tomorrow would bring a surprise that would transform not just his life, but the lives of countless others. The next morning started like any other. Marcus woke up at 5:30 a.m., fed Luna, and got ready for school. He grabbed his worn briefcase, locked his apartment door, and started down the stairs. His mind was already on today's lesson plan. He was going to teach his students about Newton's laws using toy cars and ramps. But when he stepped outside his building, Marcus stopped dead in his tracks. There, gleaming in the early morning sunlight, was a Ferrari. It was fire engine red, spotlessly clean, and looked completely out of place on his modest street. A small crowd had already gathered around it, including Miss Jenny from the cafe and Mr. Parker, who had somehow made it down from his apartment despite his bad hip. "Marcus," Miss Jenny called out. "Is this some kind of movie shooting or something?" Before Marcus could answer, a man in a crisp black suit stepped forward. He was holding an envelope and a set of keys. "Mr. Marcus Johnson?" the man asked formally. Marcus nodded, still staring at the car. "That's me, but there must be some mistake." "No mistake, sir." The man handed him the envelope. "Mrs. Eleanor Whitman asked me to deliver this to you, along with the keys to the 2024 Ferrari F8 Tributo. All paperwork has been completed, and the car is fully insured in your name." Marcus's hands shook slightly as he opened the envelope. Inside was a letter written in elegant handwriting. "Dear Mr. Johnson, this car belonged to my late husband, Robert. He was passionate about two things in life: education and this Ferrari. He always said both had the power to transform lives. Education through opportunity, and this car through the joy it brought him. When he passed away 5 years ago, he left specific instructions. This car was to be given to someone who embodied true character, someone who helped others not for recognition or reward, but because it was the right thing to do. Last night, I witnessed that person in you, not just in how you saved me from falling, but in how you spoke about your students, your community, and your calling as a teacher. The way you dropped everything, literally, to help a stranger showed me exactly who you are. The car is yours now, to keep or to sell, to use or to share. Whatever you decide, I trust it will be the right choice because you, Mr. Johnson, are exactly the kind of person Robert wanted to find. With gratitude, Eleanor Whitman. P.S. I still plan to visit your class, though I suspect by now you've realized I'm not just a casual observer. A small crowd had gathered now. Some of Marcus's students who were on their way to school had stopped to stare at the Ferrari. You could hear their excited whispers. "That's Mr. Johnson's car." "No way. Did you see the keys in his hand?" Mr. Parker had made his way over to Marcus and placed a weathered hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes life has a way of rewarding good people, son, even when they're not looking for rewards." Marcus ran his hand over the smooth hood of the Ferrari. The price of this car could probably pay off his student loans, help his mother retire early, and fund his sister's entire college education. It could also help a lot of students who couldn't afford college. His mind was racing with possibilities when another car pulled up. The same Mercedes from last night. Mrs. Whitman stepped out, elegant as ever in a green wool coat. "Good morning, Mr. Johnson," she said, smiling warmly. "I hope you don't mind my stopping by. I wanted to see your reaction in person." "Mrs. Whitman, I can't accept," Marcus started. She held up her hand. "You can, and you will. The question now is, what will you do with it?" Marcus looked around at the gathered crowd, at his students' excited faces, at Miss Jenny wiping tears from her eyes, at Mr. Parker standing proud like a father. Then he looked back at the Ferrari, its red paint catching the morning sun like a flame. In that moment, Marcus Johnson, the physics teacher who bought extra groceries for his neighbors and stayed late to help struggling students, had an idea. An idea that would change not just his life, but the lives of countless students for years to come. Marcus stood in front of the Ferrari, his mind working like one of his physics problems: action and reaction, cause and effect. Mrs. Whitman watched him quietly, a knowing look in her eyes. "Would you like to take it for a drive?" she asked, gesturing to the gleaming car. Marcus shook his head slowly, a plan forming in his mind. "Actually, Mrs. Whitman, I'd like to talk to you about something else. Could we go somewhere private?" They walked to Miss Jenny's cafe, which was already filling with its regular morning customers. Miss Jenny immediately cleared her best table in the corner and brought over 2 cups of coffee, refusing any payment. "Mrs. Whitman," Marcus began, his hands wrapped around the warm coffee cup. "How much is this Ferrari worth?" "The current market value is approximately $375,000, she replied calmly, as if discussing the price of a cup of coffee. Marcus took a deep breath. In my 5 years of teaching, I've seen so many brilliant students miss out on college because they couldn't afford it. Kids who could be doctors, engineers, scientists, giving up on their dreams because of money. He pulled out his phone and showed her some photos. "This is Maria Rodriguez, top of her class in physics, working 2 jobs to help her family. This is James Thompson, built a working robot from scraps, but can't afford college application fees. This is Sarah Kim, already solving university-level math problems, but her single mom can't even think about college tuition." Mrs. Whitman listened intently, her eyes moving from photo to photo. "I appreciate this amazing gift more than I can say," Marcus continued, "but I have an idea. What if we sold the Ferrari and used the money to start a scholarship fund? We could help students who need it most." Instead of looking disappointed, Mrs. Whitman's face broke into a broad smile. "I was hoping you'd say something like that, but I have a counter-proposal." She reached into her elegant handbag and pulled out a folder. "The Whitman Foundation already has significant resources. What we've been missing is someone who truly understands which students need help most. Someone who sees their potential and their struggles firsthand." She opened the folder, revealing documents with the Whitman Foundation letterhead. "What if we kept the Ferrari as a symbol, something to inspire students, to show them that dreams can come true, and created something bigger?" Marcus leaned forward, intrigued. "The Whitman Foundation would like to establish a new program," she explained, "the Future Makers Scholarship Fund, with an initial endowment of $5 million. We need someone to run it, someone who knows which students deserve a chance, someone who understands that character matters as much as grades." She slid the folder toward Marcus. "We'd like that someone to be you, Mr. Johnson. You keep your teaching position. We know that's where your heart is, but you'd also help us identify and support promising students who need financial help." Marcus stared at the documents, his coffee growing cold. $5 million. To start with, Mrs. Whitman smiled. And the Ferrari stays in your possession to remind everyone that sometimes helping others leads to unexpected blessings. The cafe had grown quiet. Miss Jenny pretended to wipe the same spot on the counter over and over, trying to hear what was happening. Outside, the Ferrari continued to draw crowds of amazed onlookers. There's one condition, Mrs. Whitman added. The first scholarship has to go to Maria Rodriguez. Anyone who works 2 jobs and still maintains top grades in physics deserves a chance at her dreams. Tears formed in Marcus's eyes, but he blinked them back. He thought about all his students who worked so hard despite having so little. He thought about his own mother, who had sacrificed everything to send him to college. He thought about Mr. Collins, his old physics teacher, who had believed in him when no one else did. "When do we start?" he asked, his voice firm with determination. Mrs. Whitman checked her elegant watch. "Well, you have a physics class to teach in 30 minutes. But after that," she held out her hand. "Welcome to the Whitman Foundation, Mr. Johnson. I believe this is the beginning of something extraordinary." As they shook hands, neither could have predicted just how right she was. The Ferrari parked outside was just the beginning, a shining symbol of how one simple act of kindness could open the door to changing countless lives. When Marcus walked into his classroom that morning, his students immediately noticed something different. Through the windows, they could see the red Ferrari parked in the teacher's lot. Gleaming in the morning sun, the classroom buzzed with excited whispers. "Is it true, Mr. Johnson?" Maria Rodriguez asked, her eyes wide. "Miss Jenny's daughter told me a rich lady gave you a Ferrari because you saved her life." Marcus set down his briefcase and smiled at his curious students. "The Ferrari is part of a much bigger story," he said. "And actually, Maria, I need to talk to you after class." The physics lesson that day was about momentum and impact, how one moving object could completely change the direction of another. As Marcus explained the concepts, he couldn't help but think about how perfectly it described the events of the past 24 hours. After class, Maria stayed behind, nervously adjusting her waitress uniform for her afternoon shift at her family's restaurant. "Maria," Marcus began, "how would you like to go to college without worrying about the cost?" The girl's face fell slightly. "Mr. Johnson, you know my family can't afford." "What if I told you that you've been selected as the first recipient of the Future Makers Scholarship? Full tuition, books, and living expenses for 4 years at any college that accepts you." Maria stared at him, her hands gripping the edge of her desk. "What? How?" As Marcus explained about Mrs. Whitman and the foundation, tears began rolling down Maria's cheeks. "But why me?" "Because you've earned it," Marcus said firmly. "Your grades, your hard work, your character. This is what the scholarship is all about. You just need to keep your grades up and continue being the amazing student you are." Maria pulled out her phone with shaking hands. "Can I call my mama right now?" Marcus nodded, his own eyes getting misty as he heard Maria's excited Spanish conversation with her mother, both of them crying and laughing at the same time. That afternoon, Mrs. Whitman arrived at the school. She had traded her elegant coat for a simple blazer, trying to blend in as she observed Marcus's classes. She watched as he used toy cars to demonstrate collision physics, making complex concepts simple and engaging. During the break between classes, James Thompson shyly approached Marcus's desk with his homemade robot. "Mr. Johnson, I added some new features," James said, showing how the robot could now sort different colored objects. Mrs. Whitman stepped forward, intrigued. "Did you build this yourself, young man?" James nodded nervously. "On a very limited budget," Marcus added. "James has an amazing talent for engineering." Mrs. Whitman and Marcus exchanged a knowing look. They both knew James would be a perfect candidate for the next scholarship. After school, Marcus drove the Ferrari to his mother's small house in the suburbs. She was waiting on the porch, having heard the news from what seemed like everyone in the neighborhood. "Mama," he said, hugging her tight. "Remember how you always said God works in mysterious ways?" They sat on the porch swing as Marcus told her everything about Mrs. Whitman, the foundation, and especially about Maria's scholarship. His mother listened, tears streaming down her face. "Your father would be so proud," she whispered. "He always said you had a teacher's heart." Later that evening, Marcus sat in his apartment, looking at the Ferrari keys on his small kitchen table. Luna curled up in his lap as he made a list of students who might qualify for future scholarships. Each name represented a dream that could now become reality. His phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Wakeman. Committee meeting tomorrow at 9 a.m. Bring your list of potential candidates. And Marcus, thank you for proving that Robert and I were right about the power of education and kindness. Marcus looked out his window at the Ferrari, now parked on his humble street. It looked out of place, yet somehow perfect. A symbol of how life can change in unexpected ways. But the real magic wasn't in the expensive car. It was in the lives that were about to change, the dreams that would now have a chance to flourish, and the ripple effect that would touch countless families for generations to come. What had started with a simple act of kindness was growing into something far bigger than Marcus had ever imagined. And this was just the beginning. 5 years had passed since that snowy evening when Marcus Johnson caught Mrs. Eleanor Whitman on the icy steps. The Ferrari still sat in his driveway, though now it was used mainly for special occasions, graduation ceremonies, scholarship announcements, and motivational visits to inner-city schools. On this particular spring morning, Marcus stood on the stage of Brighton High School's auditorium, looking out at a sea of excited faces. Beside him sat Mrs. Whitman, now 83 but still elegant and sharp as ever. They were about to announce the 5th class of Future Makers scholars. When I caught Mrs. Whitman that evening, Marcus began his speech. I was just doing what my mother taught me, helping someone in need. I never imagined that simple act would lead to this. He gestured to the first row, where Maria Rodriguez sat in her medical school white coat. She had just finished her 2nd year at Harvard Medical School, top of her class. Next to her was James Thompson, now a junior at MIT, his latest robotics project having won national awards. In 5 years, Marcus continued, the Future Makers Scholarship Fund has helped 58 students attend college, but more importantly, those students are now helping others. The screen behind him showed pictures. Maria running free medical clinics in her old neighborhood. James teaching robotics to middle school students. Sarah Kim, their 3rd scholarship recipient, tutoring math at community centers while studying to become a professor. Mrs. Whitman took the podium next, her voice strong despite her age. The true measure of success isn't in how much we gain, but in how much we give back. Each of our scholars embodies this principle. Together, they announced the new class of 12 scholars. Each student had a story. Children of immigrants, single-parent families, kids who worked jobs to help their families while maintaining excellent grades. As each name was called, the auditorium erupted in cheers. After the ceremony, Marcus found himself surrounded by past and present scholars. Maria hugged him tight. Remember when you told me about the scholarship in your classroom? She laughed. I called my mama crying so hard she thought something was wrong. And now look at you, Marcus smiled proudly. Dr. Rodriguez in training. Mr. Parker, now using a wheelchair but still sharp as ever, had come to watch the ceremony. You've built quite a legacy here, son, he said, patting Marcus's hand. Quite a legacy indeed. Later that evening, Marcus and Mrs. Whitman sat in Miss Jenny's cafe, just like they had 5 years ago. The cafe was closing for the day, but Miss Jenny insisted on serving them coffee and her famous apple pie. Did you ever imagine it would grow like this? Mrs. Whitman asked, stirring her coffee. Marcus shook his head. Never. But you know what makes me happiest? Watching these kids help others. It's like dropping a stone in a pond. The ripples just keep going. Mrs. Whitman pulled out an envelope. Speaking of ripples, the foundation board met yesterday. We're doubling the endowment. Next year, we can help twice as many students. Marcus's eyes widened. $10 million? You've proven that money invested in good people yields the best returns, she smiled. Oh, and the board loved your idea about the mentorship program, having older scholars mentor the new ones. Through the cafe window, they could see the Ferrari parked outside, its red paint catching the evening sun. A group of kids were taking pictures next to it, dreaming of their own futures. You know, Marcus said thoughtfully, people still ask me why I kept the car instead of selling it. But every time I see a kid's face light up looking at it, I remember what you said about it being a symbol of how dreams can come true. Mrs. Whitman reached across the table and squeezed his hand. Robert would have loved all of this. He always said education was like a key that could unlock any door. You've proven him right. As they sat there, watching the sunset through Miss Jenny's cafe window, both Marcus and Mrs. Whitman knew that this was more than just a story about a man saving a woman from falling or about a Ferrari appearing one morning. It was a story about how kindness creates kindness, how one good deed can multiply beyond imagination. The Future Makers Scholarship Fund would continue growing, touching more lives, creating more opportunities. And it all started with a simple choice, the choice to help someone in need without expecting anything in return. Sometimes the greatest legacies start with the smallest acts of kindness. For Marcus Johnson, that legacy was just beginning.